Okay, let's dive into something deeply unsettling today. Just try and picture this for a second. You've got this feeling of like meticulous planning, saving up money, booking flights, counting down the days for a really big trip.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's a 17-year-old girl, Phoebe Bishop, in Gingin, Queensland. She's all set to fly across the country to finally see her high school sweetheart. It's all about hope, future plans.
Right. That anticipation.
Exactly. And then just a few weeks later, the absolute unthinkable happens. Her housemates, the people she was living with, they're charged. Not just with her murder, but also with 2 counts of interfering with her body.
The speed of that is just,
Yeah,
it
it
really
really
is.
is. The sheer speed and, well, the nature of that escalation, going from a missing teenager who had really clear plans to murder charges involving alleged, deliberate concealment,
Mhm.
it's jarring. It really demands we take a closer look.
What's profoundly striking about this case, right from the very beginning, is exactly that abrupt, disturbing pivot you mentioned. As you said, the transition from, well, a hopeful, meticulously planned trip to charges of this gravity,
Yeah.
laid against the people she was living with, and them doing it so remarkably quickly after she was reported missing, it really speaks volumes about the kind of compelling evidence police must have rapidly pulled together.
Absolutely. So, welcome everyone. This is a deep dive into the case of Phoebe Bishop. As we said, she's been missing from Gingin, Queensland since May 15th, 2025.
That's the date she was last reportedly seen.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack the source material we've got. It's a collection of news reports, police statements, timelines, that sort of thing. Our mission here really is to cut through the noise and just understand the critical facts as they've been presented publicly. We want to identify the key players, trace the, well, surprising turns this investigation has already taken, and really analyze what makes this case stand out, especially given that right now, Phoebe's body still hasn't been found.
Which is a major factor.
It is, and we'll specifically scrutinize what those charges murder, and again, 2 counts of interfering with a corpse, what they tell us about the official police theory of what might have happened.
And it's absolutely crucial, I think, to state clearly right up front. Our purpose in going through these sources is to understand the documented facts, to see how the investigation unfolded based on the publicly available information.
Right.
We are strictly, distilling the details reported in these sources. We're not here to speculate beyond what the evidence, as is presented, might imply.
Yeah.
And we are certainly not taking sides, especially given how sensitive this case is and the fact that legal proceedings are ongoing.
Definitely not.
This is all about gaining a clear understanding of the factual timeline and, well, the basis for the serious charges that have been laid, just as reported in the sources we have.
That clarity is absolutely key. We're looking at the pieces as the investigation seems to have discovered them and, presented them. So let's go right back to the beginning. Who was Phoebe Bishop, and what were the circumstances leading up to that critical date, May 15th?
Well, the sources describe her, as you said, as a 17-year-old living in Gingin. And she had these very, very definite plans to travel to Western Australia.
Yeah, you mentioned that right at the top, not just a vague idea.
Not at all. The reports really emphasize she had meticulously planned this journey. She'd pre-booked her flight,
Mm.
and she had diligently saved money specifically for the airfare. This paints a picture of, deliberate, goal-oriented action, not someone who's likely to just abandon everything on a whim.
That meticulous planning, it feels important. The saving, the booking.
It's incredibly important. That level of intentionality, the financial investment she made, the pre-booking, it's all powerful evidence right away that weighs against any simple story of, voluntary disappearance or just running away. When someone has made such concrete preparations for a future event, especially one as significant as traveling right across the country to see her boyfriend, who's described as her high school sweetheart, their failure to actually follow through is a huge red flag. It strongly suggests something must have intervened.
Okay, and where exactly was she living around this time?
The sources state she was residing with 2 people, James Wood, who's 34, and Tanika Kristen Bromley, she's 33. They're referred to in the report sometimes as her associates, or simply her housemates.
Associates or housemates, and the place itself.
The property in Gingin, where they lived, is described using terms like dilapidated or even derelict.
Wow, okay.
And James Wood himself, he's actually quoted directly in one report. He apparently said Phoebe was living with them because she, quote, couldn't live at home anymore.
So living with these associates in a reportedly dilapidated place because she couldn't be at home.
Right. That living situation, it provides really important context about Phoebe's immediate environment just before she vanished. Residing in a place called Dilapidated, described as being with associates rather than, say, family, and away from her own home. It points to a potentially complex, maybe even unstable domestic situation.
Makes sense.
And while the sources don't really elaborate on why she couldn't live at home, that detail itself becomes relevant background information. Something police would have definitely considered when trying to understand her circumstances and relationships leading up to her disappearance.
Okay, so we have a picture forming of her plans, her living situation. Now let's zero in on the day she was last seen, May 15th, 2025. The reported last sighting puts her near Bundaberg Airport.
That's right.
The sources state she was reportedly being driven towards the airport by her housemates, Wood and Bromley, in a specific car, a gray Hyundai i435. Her flight was scheduled for 8:30 that morning, a journey connecting through Brisbane before heading all the way to Perth.
A long trip.
Yeah, and reports mention she was seen carrying luggage on Airport Drive, which is near the airport itself.
Okay, and this is the precise moment, this reported sighting near the airport, where the publicly presented narrative of her movements that day starts to fundamentally clash with verifiable evidence the police uncovered.
Okay. What's the clash?
The critical fact, stated explicitly in the sources based on police findings, is that surveillance footage from inside the airport unequivocally confirmed that she never entered the terminal, nor did she check in for her scheduled flight.
Whoa, okay. Never even went inside. That feels huge. Here's where the initial alarm bells for the police must have just started screaming, right?
Absolutely.
She's got the flight book, she saved the money, she has her luggage with her, she's reportedly driven right to the vicinity of the airport, but she never actually goes inside the terminal, never checks in. From an investigator's point of view, what does that specific, undeniable fact immediately tell you? Why is that such a critical piece of early evidence?
Well, look, this is the piece of evidence that immediately shifts the case way out of the realm of just a typical missing person inquiry. Someone with a pre-booked flight, paid for, meticulously planned cross-country trip. They do not simply fail to enter the building and check in when they are supposedly right there with their luggage.
No, you wouldn't think so.
Her failure to even step foot inside the terminal fundamentally undermines any possibility that she was dropped off to catch her flight and then maybe something happened after she was alone. It suggests very, very strongly that whatever prevented her from taking that flight must have happened before she could even get inside or check in.
Okay, so it pushes the timeline back.
Significantly. It shifts the potential timeline of whatever happened, intervention, incapacitation, something worse significantly earlier in the day before any supposed airport drop-off.
Right, it puts the critical event, whatever it was, much earlier than just after a simple drop-off near the airport. And this fact is then compounded by another really crucial piece of early evidence mentioned in the sources, the digital silence.
Ah, yes, the digital silence. This is perhaps even more telling, especially in those very early stages of the investigation. The sources highlight the timing very clearly. Her phone, her social media accounts, and her bank accounts, they all ceased activity on May 14th.
May 14th.
Yes. That's a full day before she was reportedly seen near the airport on the morning of May 15th.
Wow. Okay, a day before the last reported sighting near the airport for a cross-country flight she'd meticulously saved and planned for? What does that digital silence, predating her last confirmed potential sighting, immediately and powerfully suggest to investigators?
Look, this is a critical piece of evidence. It strongly compels law enforcement to classify the case as suspicious almost immediately. Think about it. When someone's entire digital footprint, their phone, social media, banking just goes dark suddenly and stays dark.
Yeah.
Especially someone who's planning a major trip that absolutely requires communication and access to funds. It paints a very, very clear picture.
Doesn't sound like someone just deciding to disappear voluntarily.
Exactly. This silence, occurring before the date she was last seen near the airport, essentially eliminates the possibility of a voluntary disappearance where she maybe just decided to leave but was still using her phone or accessing money somewhere else. It points extremely strongly towards her being incapacitated or forcibly prevented from communicating or possibly even deceased before the morning of May 15th.
So foul play becomes a much stronger possibility very early on.
It's powerful evidence suggesting foul play or some kind of involuntary event occurred well before she could even attempt to start her trip.
That really does paint a grim picture, and it explains why the police response seems to have been so rapid. They weren't just dealing with a missing teen scenario anymore. They were dealing with a teen whose digital life vanished the day before a major planned event, and who then failed to even reach the starting line of that event despite reportedly being taken right there. That digital silence is just incredibly difficult to explain away.
Precisely. The speed with which the police moved really reflects how alarming these initial facts were. You had the failure to board this meticulously planned flight, coupled with and critically supported by the sudden and earlier onset of her digital silence.
And the sources we have document this rapid escalation pretty clearly. A missing person report was filed on May 16th, that makes sense, after she didn't arrive in Western Australia. But remarkably quickly, by May 21st, that's just 6 days after she was last seen, police officially declared the case suspicious.
Yeah, and that rapid classification is highly unusual for a missing teenager case. Typically, these cases start with a focus on just locating the individual, often hoping for a voluntary return.
Right, hoping they just show up.
The fact that police escalated it to a suspicious case so quickly indicates that their initial inquiries, which would certainly have involved interviewing Wood and Bromley, checking those airport CCTV feeds you mentioned, and analyzing her digital activity, very rapidly generated serious concerns that pointed towards foul play.
So the pieces just weren't fitting together from the start?
No. And the public statement from Detective Acting Inspector Ryan Thompson, which is noted in the sources, expressing significant concern for her welfare. That really underscores this shift in focus away from a simple missing person case.
They must have seen something very early on that completely contradicted the idea this was just a runaway situation. And based on those immediate concerns, they moved fast to establish key locations as crime scenes.
That's correct. According to the sources, two major crime scenes were rapidly established. The first was that Jin Jin property, the one described as dilapidated, where Phoebe had been living with Wood and Bromley.
Okay, the house.
And the second was the gray Hyundai I-35 vehicle. That's the car reportedly used to drive her towards the airport that morning.
Declaring these specific locations, especially the property where she lived and the car she was supposedly in, as crime scenes so early in the investigation, even without having found a body, that seems really significant. What does that tell us about where police suspicion was immediately focused?
It tells us that based on their initial intelligence, which was likely derived from those first interviews with Wood and Bromley, maybe some preliminary forensic observations at the property or in the car, or perhaps other information they received, the police immediately focused their suspicion right onto these two specific areas.
That makes sense.
Designating them as crime scenes is a formal step that allows police to conduct really thorough, painstaking forensic examinations. They'd be searching for any trace evidence, blood, DNA, fibers, anything at all that could indicate what happened.
And the focus on the car seems particularly strong.
It does. The police issued a very specific public appeal asking for anyone with dash cam or CCTV footage of that particular gray Hyundai. They even gave the Queensland registration, 414 EW3, near the airport, and also back in Jin Jin on May 15th.
So they wanted eyes on its movements that whole day.
Exactly. This highlights just how central the car was to their investigation from the beginning. It suggests a belief that the vehicle was involved not just in transport, but potentially in transporting Phoebe during or even after the suspected critical incident occurred.
So the car wasn't just seen as transportation. Police likely suspected it might be a mobile crime scene itself, or involved in moving something crucial afterwards. And this focus then led to extensive physical searches on the ground.
Yes, search efforts became a really significant part of the police response early on. They were concentrated particularly on an area called Goodnight Scrub National Park.
Goodnight Scrub National Park, where is that in relation to things?
It's located roughly an hour's drive from Bundaberg Airport. And the scale of the resources they deployed there, as reported in the sources, was pretty substantial.
Like what?
You had homicide detectives on site, specialist units using cadaver dogs, dogs trained specifically to find human remains, divers searching waterways within the park, and numerous land and air search teams combing the area.
Wow, that's a major operation.
It is. That level of resource commitment indicates police must have had some kind of intelligence, something strongly suggesting that this specific area, Goodnight Scrub, might be where Phoebe, or perhaps evidence related to her disappearance, could be found.
The sources do mention that the search in the park was eventually scaled back, though.
That's right, after extensive efforts.
But a critical piece of information, a really powerful detail, reportedly emerged from that search effort in the park.
Yes, this is a key finding that was reported. The search revealed evidence might have been moved from the national park before police arrived.
Okay, let's really unpack that statement. Evidence might have been moved from the national park before police got there. What are the significant implications of that specific finding? What does that suggest about the actions of whoever might have been involved?
Look, this detail is incredibly significant.
Right.
It directly supports the serious charges that were later laid. Firstly, just the idea that evidence might have been moved, that suggests a deliberate act, right? An act of concealment or maybe even destruction of evidence.
Not just lost or missed, actively moved.
Exactly. It's not something being overlooked. It's potentially something being actively removed. But then you add the phrase, before police arrived. That adds another whole layer. It implies a degree of awareness, maybe foresight, or perhaps even, monitoring of the police investigation on the part of whoever moved the evidence.
Like they knew the police might search there.
Possibly. They might have anticipated that police would eventually search that area. Or perhaps they even saw the police presence starting to build and acted quickly to remove things. This finding provides really concrete support for the concept of interfering with the corpse. It paints a picture of a calculated effort to obstruct justice, to prevent the police from finding crucial evidence.
And does that finding potentially line up with those 2 counts of interfering with the corpse that the housemates were eventually charged with?
Absolutely, it aligns very strongly. The finding that evidence might have been moved from that specific location, the national park, supports at least one act of concealment or interference, right?
Oh.
But the fact that they were ultimately charged with 2 counts implies that police believe there were at least 2 distinct events where Phoebe's body was concealed, moved, or otherwise tampered with.
So not just one disposal, but potentially multiple actions.
Exactly. When you combine the charge of 2 counts of interfering with the finding that evidence was potentially moved from the park before police got there, it suggests a possible scenario. Maybe there was an initial act of disposal or concealment, perhaps in the park, and then maybe later a second act to move the body or evidence away from that location, perhaps when the search commenced or seemed likely.
That sounds quite calculated.
It indicates a potentially more complex, maybe multi-stage effort to evade detection, not just a single panicked act of disposal.
That distinction between 1 count and 2 counts, especially supported by the finding that evidence might have been moved from the search area, really seems to underscore the deliberate nature of the alleged actions after the death.
It does. It adds a layer of alleged premeditation and persistence to the charges, beyond just the act of causing death itself. It points to a significant effort allegedly aimed at preventing the location of the body and frustrating the investigation.
The sources also briefly touch on a couple of other leads that were apparently explored during the investigation. Things like reports of an argument in the car where Phoebe was allegedly forced out,
Yes, that was mentioned.
and those unconfirmed reports that were circulating about dead dogs being found at the property.
Right. It's important to note how these are presented in the sources, usually as leads that police investigated or as unconfirmed reports that were floating around during the inquiry.
So part of the background noise of the investigation.
To some extent, yes. As is standard procedure in any missing person or potential homicide investigation, police would absolutely pursue various lines of inquiry based on any information they receive. However, the fact that the formal charges laid focus specifically on murder and interfering with a corpse, and not, for example, charges directly related to an assault during an argument, or animal cruelty charges, that suggests that while these other leads may well have been explored, the evidence police gathered ultimately led them to build their case primarily around the cause of death and the subsequent handling and concealment of the body.
So those other things are part of the investigative history, but the formal charges reflect where the strongest evidence pointed.
Precisely. The charges reflect what the police believe they possess the strongest evidence to prosecute.
That clarifies their status within the overall picture presented by the police charges. Now, let's move to the people who are really at the center of this case now, at least from the perspective of the charges laid. The housemates, James Wood and Tanika Kristen Bromley. James Wood, quite notably, made some public statements to the Daily Mail that are included in the sources.
Yes, Wood gave an interview, and in it, he offered a particular description of Phoebe and also his version of the events of May 15th. He characterized Phoebe as having, quote, heightened emotions and a temper. He mentioned an incident where she had apparently smashed a TV before the trip was planned. But then, almost paradoxically, he also called her a great kid.
That's an interesting mix of descriptions. Why might someone facing this kind of scrutiny or potential charges down the line choose to characterize the missing person that way? emphasizing volatility or negative traits alongside positive ones.
Well, it's a tactic that's sometimes seen, particularly in cases where perhaps an altercation is being suggested or might be used as part of a potential defense strategy later on.
How so?
By portraying Phoebe as having heightened emotions or a temper, Wood could potentially be attempting to lay the groundwork for a narrative where, maybe, an argument occurred. This could suggest perhaps an accidental death resulted from a volatile situation, or maybe even argue provocation down the track.
Trying to shift blame or lessen culpability?
It could be an attempt to shift blame, yes, or suggest a less culpable scenario than, say, intentional murder. Or maybe just an attempt to paint the victim in a light that might elicit some degree of understanding, however slight, for the accused's alleged actions or reactions.
Interesting. And then there's a specific account of what he says happened at the airport. This directly addresses that moment she was last seen.
Right. Wood claimed in that same interview that he and Bromley drove Phoebe to Airport Drive. He said they stopped about half a mile from the terminal, supposedly, quote, to give her 5 minutes, give her her own space.
Give her space half a mile from the terminal she needed to check into.
That was his claim. He maintained that when they returned maybe 5 minutes later, she and her bag were just gone, and he said they simply assumed she had gone inside and boarded her flight.
Okay. But as we discussed earlier, the police obtained that CCTV footage. The footage that definitively shows she never entered the terminal or checked in for her flight.
And this is precisely why James Wood's public story becomes such a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence against him and Bromley. His account directly conflicts with confirmed police findings based on objective, verifiable CCTV footage.
It's not just a slightly different memory, it's a direct contradiction.
Exactly. The fact that he maintained this specific, detailed narrative publicly, a narrative that is demonstrably false according to the police evidence, strongly suggests a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators and the public about what actually happened on May 15th. It's not merely a faulty memory claim, it's presenting an alibi or a sequence of events that the physical evidence flatly contradicts.
And that attempt to actively mislead, maintaining a story you know is verifiably false about such a key moment, that's extremely damaging evidence in itself, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It points strongly towards consciousness of guilt. It suggests an effort to conceal the truth of what actually occurred that morning.
Okay. Now, let's look at the most significant development reported in the sources. The arrests and the formal charges being laid. This sequence seemed to unfold very, very quickly.
Yes, the timeline here is really telling. James Wood was initially arrested on June 4th. He was questioned by police for several hours, according to reports, but then he was released without charge.
Released without charge. So he's interviewed. Police clearly have some suspicions, enough to arrest him, but not enough at that specific moment to actually charge him with anything. And then what happens?
Then, the very next day, June 5th, there's a dramatic shift. Both James Wood and Tonica Kristen Bromley were rearrested in the Bundaberg area. And this time, they weren't just questioned and released, they were formally charged.
Formally charged. And the charges were?
They were formally charged with 1 count each of murder and 2 counts each of interfering with a corpse.
Okay, going from Wood being released without charge one day to both housemates being arrested and charged with murder and 2 counts of body interference the very next day. That's a massive leap in just 24 hours. What does that rapid progression strongly indicate about the investigation's activity during that short window?
This indicates a significant, probably pivotal development must have occurred between Wood's release late on June 4th and the rearrest and charging of both individuals on June 5th. It strongly suggests that police either acquired some new crucial evidence during that period, or perhaps existing evidence was finally corroborated or analyzed in a way that strengthened their case sufficiently to meet the legal threshold for laying murder charges.
So something clicked into place.
Something crucial must have fallen into place. This new evidence could potentially have come from, say, the completion of forensic analysis on items seized from the Jin Jin property or the Hyundai. It could have been specific findings from those detailed searches in Goodnight Scrub or maybe other areas. Or, potentially, it could have been a breakthrough from a witness providing critical new information or finally coming forward.
Whatever it was enough to go from release to murder charges overnight.
The timing points directly to a critical piece of the puzzle falling into place that transforms suspicion into formal prosecutable charges.
And the charges themselves are obviously very specific and incredibly serious. Murder implies police believe they caused her death through foul play. But again, those 2 counts of interfering with a corpse, they really stand out.
They absolutely do. As we touched on earlier, the charge of interfering with a corpse means police allege the accused actively took steps, deliberate steps, to conceal, move, or tamper with Phoebe's body after she died.
Right.
The fact that they faced 2 counts each is particularly informative. It strongly suggests police believe there were at least 2 distinct, separate acts involving the concealment or movement of her body.
So not just one instance, but 2 separate efforts.
At least 2, yes. When you consider this, alongside that finding from the Goodnight scrub search that evidence might have been moved from the park before police arrived, it powerfully supports the idea of a calculated, potentially multi-stage effort to hide the body and evade discovery.
It suggests more planning than panic.
It moves beyond potentially a single act of disposal and points towards alleged deliberate planning and execution of concealment attempts, potentially involving moving the body from one location maybe to another, perhaps in response to the investigation closing in.
So the charges themselves aren't just about the alleged killing. They detail the alleged actions taken afterwards, suggesting a significant effort to prevent the body from being found, and police believe there were at least 2 separate instances of that effort.
Exactly. It's a very clear statement from the police, via the charges, about the nature of the alleged actions taken following Phoebe's death.
The sources also mention that Wood and Bromley were scheduled for court appearances soon after being charged, and they briefly report on some previous, apparently unrelated, weapons offenses they had faced.
That's right. Their court appearance marks the formal beginning of the legal process. That's where the prosecution will start to present the evidence they've gathered to support these very serious charges. The mention of previous unrelated offenses is included in some reports, but it's typically presented as background information, distinct from the specific charges in Phoebe Bishop's case.
Got it. Now, despite these incredibly significant developments, you've got the arrests, the serious charges laid, there's one central, really agonizing aspect of this case that remains unresolved.
And that is the fact, stated very clearly in all the sources, that Phoebe Bishop's remains have not been located to date.
Right. Her body hasn't been found. That absence must present a significant challenge for the prosecution, doesn't it? I mean, in many murder cases, the body itself provides crucial evidence about the cause and manner of death.
It absolutely can present a significant challenge for the prosecution. There's no doubt about that. The body itself can be, a primary source of forensic evidence. It can confirm injury, cause of death, maybe even provide trace evidence linking it to a specific location or individuals involved.
But it's not impossible to proceed.
No. The sources also correctly note that the absence of a body is not an insurmountable obstacle. It's more difficult, but convictions for murder can be secured, and have been secured in the past, based entirely on compelling circumstantial evidence.
Okay, so even without that key piece of physical evidence, the body a case can still potentially be built. What does that mean in the context of this specific case, based on the circumstantial evidence we've discussed from the sources? What pieces of this puzzle can police and prosecutors realistically use to try and build that compelling case without Phoebe's body?
Well, based on the information reported in the sources, the circumstantial evidence that would likely form the core of the prosecution's case includes several key elements we've touched on. Firstly, there are the demonstrably false and conflicting statements made by the accused, particularly Wood's detailed but contradicted account of the airport drop-off. That serves as powerful evidence of attempts to deceive.
Right, the cover story that didn't match the facts.
Exactly.
Yep.
Secondly, the very act of declaring the Jin property and the gray Hyundai as crime scenes implies that significant forensic findings were likely recovered from those locations that are relevant to the case. Perhaps traces of blood, DNA, cleaning products, or other physical evidence connecting them to Phoebe's disappearance. Thirdly, that sudden and completely unexplained cessation of Phoebe's digital activity back on May 14th, the day before she was last seen, is absolutely critical evidence. It counters any claim of voluntary disappearance and points strongly towards an involuntary event happening before that airport trip was even supposed to start.
And the charges themselves.
And crucially, yes, the charges themselves, particularly those 2 counts of interfering with a corpse. When you combine those specific charges with the finding that evidence might have been moved from the search area, it implies police have evidence suggesting deliberate, calculated acts of concealment and obstruction after her death.
So it's like building a mosaic.
That's a good way to put it. This mosaic of indirect evidence attempts to deceive, forensic findings from associated locations, timeline inconsistencies like the digital silence, and evidence pointing to post-crime concealment can collectively paint a picture that prosecutors will argue is strong enough to satisfy a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, even without the physical presence of the body.
It's really a case built on weaving together all these other threads when the central piece is missing. It certainly highlights how sophisticated modern investigations have become, relying heavily on other forms of evidence.
It really does. It showcases the immense importance of things like digital forensics, trace evidence analysis from crime scenes, and meticulously analyzing the behavior and statements of those involved, especially when the most direct physical evidence the body is unavailable.
And despite the charges having been laid, the search for Phoebe's body itself continues, doesn't it?
Yes, Queensland police have been very clear that the investigation remains ongoing. Detectives continue to pursue leads. They've also stated that physical searches will continue as deemed necessary. But critically, these future searches will likely be contingent upon the provision of new information.
Contingent on new information. What does that reliance on new information tell us about the current state of the search for her body? It sounds like they've maybe exhausted the leads they had for broad area searches.
It suggests that yes, despite the extensive searches already conducted, including those large-scale efforts in areas like Goodnight Scrub National Park, police haven't yet pinpointed the specific location where Phoebe's remains might be. They've clearly gathered enough circumstantial evidence to lay charges, but locating her body remains a critical priority.
So they need a more specific tip now.
Essentially, yes. They seem to be indicating that future physical search efforts will likely require specific intelligence or credible new information to guide them, rather than just conducting more broad, speculative searches of large areas. This new information could potentially come from the public. Maybe someone remembers something now the case details are out. Or it could even potentially be revealed during the legal process, perhaps even from the accused themselves, though that's speculative.
Right.
While the case can proceed legally without the body, finding her remains is absolutely vital for ultimate closure for her family. And of course, it could potentially yield further direct evidence to strengthen the prosecution's case even more.
That need for closure really brings us to the human element of this, which is just a profound tragedy. Phoebe's family, especially her mother, has been a constant, powerful voice throughout this whole ordeal.
Yes, Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson, has been a prominent voice, as the sources describe her, right from the beginning. The reports detail her making numerous emotional appeals for information, often utilizing social media platforms like Facebook to try and reach as wide an audience as possible.
And her appeals have consistently stressed that Phoebe's disappearance was completely unlike her, right? Completely out of character.
Exactly. She has repeatedly emphasized the profound and uncharacteristic silence from Phoebe since May 15th. Her public statements really convey the immeasurable pain and the agonizing uncertainty the family is enduring.
It's hard to even imagine.
Phrases reported like, "Our lives have been changed for the worse. This is a pain no person or family should ever have to experience." They starkly communicate the depth of their grief. She's acknowledged the likely worst-case scenario, but understandably she desperately seeks knowledge of Phoebe's resting place, so they can have some form of closure.
Just wanting to know where she is.
And she also specifically stated, very powerfully, that Phoebe would never not contact us at this emotional time, particularly pointing out significant family mourning periods that were actually occurring around the time of her disappearance. This directly reinforces the police's finding that this was not a voluntary act on Phoebe's part.
Her public appeals seem to serve multiple vital purposes, don't they? Beyond just expressing the family's grief.
They absolutely do. They are, first and foremost, a direct, heartfelt plea for anyone out there with any information, no matter how small or insignificant they think it might be, to please come forward. They also serve to keep Phoebe's case constantly in the public consciousness, preventing it from fading away as other news cycles move on. And crucially, Kylie Johnson's consistent message that this behavior is not like Phoebe acts as a powerful personal counterpoint to any lingering suggestion that her daughter simply ran away or chose to disappear. It directly supports the police's stance that her disappearance was suspicious and involuntary from the start.
And it seems the community in Jinjin has clearly rallied around Phoebe's family during this incredibly difficult time.
Yes, the sources mentioned significant solidarity and support coming from the local community there. This was particularly visible through a campaign called Leave the Lights On for Phoebe.
Leave the lights on for Phoebe. What did that involve?
Residents actively participated by posting photos online showing their front porch lights illuminated. It was intended as a symbolic gesture, like a guiding light for Phoebe to find her way back home.
That's quite touching. What does that kind of collective community action signify in a case like this? It feels like more than just sympathy.
It really is more than just sympathy. It's a collective act of solidarity and shared concern. While it obviously carries that element of hope for her return, the context of the missing person case, and now especially with the murder charges laid, implies an implicit understanding within the community of just how dire the circumstances are likely to be.
A shared understanding of the gravity.
Exactly. The campaign becomes this continuous, visible statement of support for the family. It's a refusal to let Phoebe's disappearance be forgotten. And it also acts as a silent, ongoing appeal to anyone in that community who might hold some piece of information to come forward and help bring resolution to this tragedy. It really highlights the deep impact her disappearance has had locally.
It really shows how a community can come together even in the face of something so utterly devastating.
It does. It's a powerful demonstration of shared humanity and support during a time of just immense grief and prolonged uncertainty for everyone who knew her and her family.
Okay, so bringing together everything we've explored in this deep dive today.
We have the core established facts, right? A 17-year-old, Phoebe Bishop, who had clear, documented plans for a major cross-country trip. Her digital presence suddenly went dark the day before her last reported sighting near the airport. And she definitively failed to board her scheduled and paid-for flight, which was confirmed by airport CCTV.
And those early discrepancies immediately raised red flags for police.
Huge red flags, leading to that swift classification of her case as suspicious, not just missing.
The investigation then rapidly focused on her housemates, James Wood and Tanika Kristen Bromley, the property where she lived with them in Jinjin, and the gray Hyundai vehicle reportedly used on the morning of May 15th.
Yep.
And within weeks, based on the evidence police had gathered, which presumably included findings from extensive searches, forensic examinations, and that stark contradiction between Wood's public account and the physical evidence, Wood and Bromley were arrested and charged.
Charged with Phoebe's murder and, very specifically, 2 counts each of interfering with a corpse.
And those specific charges, the interference counts, seem to align with the police finding that evidence might have been deliberately moved from a key search area, the national park.
Exactly, suggesting alleged calculated efforts to conceal Phoebe's body and obstruct the investigation, potentially through at least 2 distinct acts of concealment or movement.
But the most challenging aspect, the central unresolved piece, remains the fact that Phoebe's body has not been located.
That's right. However, as the sources indicate, and as legal precedent shows, this difficulty, while significant, is not a complete barrier to prosecution. A case can be built and potentially proven using compelling circumstantial evidence.
Like the accused's conflicting statements, the established timeline of events, forensic findings from key locations like the house and car, and that evidence supporting the charges of body interference.
Correct. All those pieces woven together.
And the investigation remains active. Police are still pursuing leads and are relying on new information to, hopefully, eventually, locate Phoebe's remains, which remains absolutely crucial for closure for her family. And throughout this whole terrible ordeal, Phoebe's mother and the Jinjin community have been incredibly vocal in their appeals for information and their expressions of solidarity, reinforcing the involuntary nature of her disappearance and keeping her case firmly in the public eye. The legal process against Wood and Bromley is now officially underway.
Yes, the charges have been laid. That marks a critical step towards potential accountability in this deeply distressing case, even as the search for Phoebe herself continues.
This case really makes you pause and ponder, doesn't it, about the nature of justice and evidence when the most tangible piece of physical proof, the victim's body, is missing. How do investigators and prosecutors actually weave together these seemingly disparate pieces of circumstantial evidence, things like digital footprints, witness statements or lack thereof, forensic traces, even the alleged actions taken after the fact, like those 2 counts of interference? How do they build a narrative strong enough to stand up in court?
It truly highlights the complexity and sometimes the limitations of modern forensic investigations. It forces us to consider how things like the sudden cessation of digital activity can become incredibly powerful indicators of foul play. How conflicting accounts, especially from those closest to the victim, become potent evidence of deception. And how charges related specifically to post-mortem actions, particularly multiple counts of interference like we see here, can potentially reveal the alleged intent and the extent of efforts made to cover up a crime.
And that specific detail, the 2 counts of interference, it really makes you think about what sequence of events the police believe might have occurred after her death, potentially involving an initial attempt at concealment that was maybe later thwarted or revised, requiring a second, separate act.
Exactly. It pushes you to consider the potential timeline and the alleged actions beyond just the moment of her death. It suggests potentially a sustained effort towards obstruction, not just a single act.
It's just a stark reminder, isn't it, that even without a body, a case can be painstakingly built, piece by circumstantial piece, relying heavily on the surrounding context and the alleged actions or inactions of those involved.
And of course, the ongoing need for information really underscores that even with charges laid, the pursuit of the full truth, and importantly, the location of Phoebe for her family's sake, is far from over.
This has been our deep dive into the disappearance of Phoebe Bishop and the subsequent charging of her housemates based on the sources shared with us. Thank you so much for joining us as we work through the complex facts and the difficult developments in this ongoing situation.
Understanding how these various pieces of information, from CCTV footage and digital activity records to forensic findings from searches, how they all come together, helps illuminate the intricate and often challenging process of serious criminal investigations.
Absolutely. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the documented facts and the key questions surrounding this case as it stands. We invite you to continue exploring complex topics with us in the future.